Good afternoon. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm jet-lagged and sleep-deprived after 10 days in Durban, as I'm sure many of you are. And this is a very important opportunity to talk about where we are and where we're going and how we're going to get there. In June of next year, we will celebrate 20 years of the original Earth Summit at Rio +20. Just 25 years after the Brundtland Report, we have an opportunity to sit, talk, evaluate, and get ready for the next chapter in a journey towards sustainable development as a common goal. This triple win of environmental progress, social progress, and economic progress still holds true for many of us. It's still what we want it to be, but it has proven to be remarkably elusive over the last 20 years. And I want to talk a little bit about how the world has changed in the last 20 years and how we can do something about that elusiveness. There's been immense progress in the last 20 years. GDP growth has exceeded population growth, which has meant that we've been able to add incredible wealth to society at a time when we've been adding 1.2 billion people to the planet. In 1992, 40% of the world's population was poor, was living in poverty. We estimate that by the time we get to Rio next year, that figure will have halved. That's incredible progress. At the same time, 1.4 billion people live without access to electricity. 2.6 billion have no access to sanitation. 880 million have no access to safe, clean drinking water. 1 billion go to bed hungry every night. And 900 million live more than 2 kilometers away from an all-weather road. And where does the growth, where does the progress, where do the jobs come from? For most people, they come from small businesses. 2.3 billion small businesses still have no access to finance in today's world, and 1.7 billion households have no access to any form of bank account, which means they cannot save effectively, and they cannot insure effectively, and therefore cannot build their own resilience to the shocks that mean that the poor are so vulnerable and least resilient to a fall back into poverty. But when we look at the 3 pillars of social progress, of economic progress, and environmental progress, it's probably in the field of environmental progress where we seem to have made least progress. The values are wrong. If the biodiversity is living, we put a value of 0 on it. If it's dead, if it's felled, if it's on our plate, we put a high price on it. We are operating so far beyond the safe space in the area of climate change, in the nitrogen cycle, in ocean health and biomass. Biodiversity is under severe pressure. In some cases, it is irreversibly lost. This is the area where we've probably got the furthest to go. When I think about next year, I like to think about how the world has changed in the last 20 years. In 1992, when we were looking for solutions in Agenda 21, the action plan that came out of the Earth Summit, we were looking for public sector solutions. We were looking principally for the role that overseas development aid would play in financing sustainable development in the developing world. Today, every problem has a public-private solution. The role of the private sector in driving growth and development is well understood. Leveraging the private sector with public finance, public policy, regulation, legislation is the focus of work. We need to mobilize all forms of capital and finance in order to support sustainable development, including the domestic capital markets which have grown and developed in the poor countries that have seen so much growth since Rio. 20 years ago, it was really a story of the ministries of environment. Next year, if that is the collective audience of Rio, we will have failed to begin with. The challenge of sustainable development now is a challenge of ministers of finance, of planning, of development, of energy, of agriculture, and environment, and more. Famously, 20 years ago, the phrase, "and women and children," was added 140 times to the final document of Rio in the last preparatory committee meeting. Because nobody thought about the perspective or the reality of the lives of women and children until that time. Now, we in the World Bank Group at least understand that if we look through development growth from the perspective of gender, then we can see the pathway towards smart economics and smart business. 60% of small farmers in Africa are women, yet they only have access to 5% of the credit available for the agricultural sector in the continent. Imagine if we did something about that, how we could get resources into the productive hands of women who we know make different family and community investment decisions with that income. They invest it in their children's education, they invest it in family health, they invest it in different inputs and into the stewardship of the land. 20 years ago, the story was one of a transfer of technology and finance from north to south, from global north to global south. Well, as other people have said, this is a very flat earth now. An investment in technology of flying north to south, south to south, south to north. And this has to be understood and recognized in the way we choose to move forward. 20 years ago, it was very much a story of development. Really, the story now is one of growth, but a choice around what kind of growth. It has to be green growth. It has to be inclusive growth. It has to be sustainable growth. Sustainable development is our goal, achieved through a pathway of growth which is different, is one about making choices and one about letting people realize opportunities. But each one of those opportunities and each one of those choices is being redefined and reframed by climate change. In fact, climate change is taking away opportunity and choice, especially for the most vulnerable, especially for the poor, especially for the poor living in low-income countries. We've calculated again that the 2-degree temperature rise, which we are trying to manage through the Framework Convention, will take away 4 to 5 percentage points of GDP growth for sub-Saharan Africa alone. That's 4 to 5 percentage points of GDP growth that they can ill afford to just give up. So let me just say a word about Durban. It's a good news, bad news story. The good news is that the multilateral wheels haven't yet fallen off the bus. We're still moving. We still have the chance to negotiate a second commitment period for Kyoto. We still have a global conversation around adaptation. We created the shell, at least, of a green climate fund. We did more as well. The bad news is that we punted. We kicked a lot off down the field for another year. Agreements were deferred. Work has been postponed. Time is just not on our side. We have a process problem. We are stuck in how to manage the planet. Rio saw all of this. It's why we have framework conventions. Framework Convention on Climate, a global convention on biodiversity, a set of forest principles which have produced enormous wisdom, work, and progress in the last 20 years. But the speed of that progress is having a hard time keeping up with the vitality of our own unsustainable growth at the moment. So how do we deal with this problem of managing the planet? The problem of managing the planet accrues at every level of account, at the local level, at the city level, where 80% of global emissions emerge, but where 80% of the innovation and the answers will also emerge. Cities are the crucible of our future innovation. And we are urbanizing at a rate that the world has never seen before, in particular in Asia and Africa. The problems of managing the planet, of course, are revealed at the national level. And importantly, we do not yet have the frameworks for comprehensive, global, coherent plans of action at the international level. Christiana Figueres, the Executive Secretary of the Framework Convention in Durban, calls for a business plan for the planet. I agree with her. And at the World Bank Group, we think of this in terms of the 3 elements essential for success in any business plan. We need to understand which data and which evidence we are all using in order to build that business plan. We need to agree on the investment plan that underpins it. And we also need to agree on the knowledge that we need to marshal and to move around the world so that everybody can make their contribution to a business plan from which they will all either benefit or suffer. So, first of all, data and evidence. After decades of fiddling and decades of experimenting and decades of talking, it is time that we introduce comprehensive wealth accounting. In Rio, we should agree to simply move forward with comprehensive wealth accounting that puts a value on natural capital and puts a value on ecosystem services. Until that zero that we put on biodiversity alive is changed, we will never change the data set and the evidence underpinning the kinds of choices and decisions we need to make. In the World Bank Group, the acronym for this is WAVES, and we've already persuaded Botswana and Colombia and Madagascar and the Philippines and Costa Rica to lead the way, to actually start implementing this now. And we hope that by the time we get to Rio, others will have joined, and that we can simply see, through piloting and through actual implementation, how to tweak this, but that we're no longer debating it, we're now into the process of just doing it. To investment. Low-income countries desperately need diverse investment flows in order to be able to adapt to climate change and to build the basis for growth going forward, a greener kind of growth. Middle-income countries need to shift their growth patterns now in order to be able to make sure that the growth that they are enjoying is inclusive. And the flat growth of the OECD and others needs to be retrofitted. The economies need to be retrofitted so that these countries can still be places of innovation and places of ideas and places of freedom and expression to really debate how we move forward. And knowledge. After 20 years, we in the World Bank Group have put a value on and recognized the need for open data. We recognize the need for transparency. We've seen how much it's benefited our own work, and we believe in the democratization of development. So, we have seen in the last 20 years that it is possible to reduce poverty. It is possible to restore ecosystems. It is possible to generate extraordinary growth. We now need to make that growth sustainable, and we now need to be able to do all three things at the same time. Reduce poverty, protect ecosystems and restore them, and produce a kind of growth which allows everybody to enjoy the benefits of that. When I was in Rio, then just an activist, then just an NGO, I met a woman who gave me very good advice. She said to me, "Rachel, as you build your career and as you build your family, you will always be faced with choices, a fork in the road. Let me tell you that when you face that choice, always choose to do the courageous thing." We, as a global community, need to do the courageous thing in Rio and start moving some of this to collective action and put in place a business plan for the planet that is investable and that is doable soon. Thank you.